From the headquarters of TeleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm Gladys Quesada. And now we begin with the news. The Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America People's Trade Treaty condemned Sunday U.S. sanctions preventing Venezuela from purchasing COVID-19 vaccines. Last week, complying with the United States' illegal restrictions, the Swiss bank UBS withheld the Venezuelan government's payment of $10 million US, set to complete its $100 million contribution to the international COVAX facilities set by the United Nations World Health Organization. The 10-strong Alba trade group denounced U.S. sanctions as illegal and threatening the well-being, health, security, and right to life of the Venezuelan people. The U.S. has been pressing a financial and economic blockade on Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and other countries in order to impoverish their population and force a regime change. Sanctions notwithstanding, Venezuela started this month a massive vaccination campaign with Russian and Chinese jabs. Caracas announced it will domestically produce Cuban vaccines. The Chilean opposition won 15 out of 16 regional governments after the runoff ballot held on Sunday in the South American country. In Santiago's metropolitan region, politically the most relevant poll, the self-styled center-left coalition Constituent Unity narrowly beat a left-wing alliance led by the Communist Party, with a decisive help from President Sebastián Piñera's followers in Chile's three wealthiest districts. Turnout in Santiago's metropolitan area was just 19.2%, in part due to a general quarantine decreed by Piñera's government on Saturday. In other regions, it was even lower. In Santiago's region, a de facto anti-communist front, ranging from fascist to socialist, was established to support Christian Democratic former mayor and regional governor Claudio Orrego, who managed to defeat the Broad Front candidate and socialist activist Karina Oliva, only by collecting massive support in right-wing strongholds. The ruling coalition was left with just one governorate, setting the scenario for the presidential elections in November, in which a communist mayor, Daniel Jadue, leads in opinion polls. And COVID-19 continues to spread in Chile, especially in the region of Santiago, the capital city, where a total quarantine was imposed this weekend. On Sunday, 7,529 new cases and 128 fatalities were recorded by Chile's health ministry. Intensive care beds have an occupancy rate of 98%. This in spite of being one of the world's leading countries in vaccinating its population. Bolivian and Peruvian authorities have joined forces to vaccinate the Aymara community living in the borderline of both countries. Dozens of people line up in the Desaguadero International Bridge to get the vaccine doses. Authorities estimate more than 3 million Aymara people live in the Andean region, which is shared by Bolivia, Peru, and Chile. The Desaguadero city, 100 kilometers west of the Bolivian capital, La Paz, is an important crossing point that has ceased some commercial activities during the past year by the COVID-19 pandemic. The initiative comes as Peru and Bolivia report a further surge in COVID-19 cases, which authorities believe is due to a new, more contagious variant of the virus.
I'm fine and I am cheerful. I want to ask of the people in Peru and Bolivia, as siblings we are, for all to get the vaccine for everyone to be protected against this illness. For this campaign, we have prepared 1,000 vaccines that are being delivered, but this is only a beginning. We will continue vaccination in the health centers.
In Colombia, the cases of new COVID-19 infections continue in constant increase. In the last 24 hours, the South American country recorded 28,519 new infections, to an accumulated total of almost 4 million cases. 586 new deaths were reported. According to Johns Hopkins University, Colombia is the fourth most affected country in the Americas. On Sunday, Guatemala's National Coordinator for Disaster Reduction, David de Leon, informed that over 260,000 people were affected by heavy rains that ravaged the country over the last 2 weeks. The most affected departments were Alta Verapaz, El Progreso, Guatemala, Solola, and Totonicapán, where landslides, fall of trees, and floods occurred. A young woman and 2 minors died in Santa Catarina y Ixtohuacan village because of the Kiba rivers overflowing. According to the latest reports, over 4,000 people were evacuated and more than 1,000 houses suffered slight or moderate damages. Guatemala was devastated by the passing of hurricanes Ida and Iota in November 2020, when 1.7 million people were affected and 61 citizens died. Dozens of Brazilians protested against the Copa America after several players were tested positive for COVID-19. The demonstration was held in the city of Brasilia, where the first match of the tournament took place. At least 13 members of the Venezuelan delegation were reportedly infected with COVID-19 and remained confined in the local hotel. Critics said the tournament can only increase the risk of contagions in the already badly hit South American nation. The coup was due to take place in both Argentina and Colombia, but was transferred at the last minute to Brazil due to sanitary restrictions imposed by Argentina and the popular revolt in Colombia. In the first day of the game, Brazil defeated Venezuela 3-0, while Ecuador lost to Colombia by 1 score. Likewise, indigenous peoples protest in Brasilia in defense of their rights and against the America's Soccer Cup. Hundreds of protesters marched to the Mané Garrincha Stadium in the city of Brasilia. They reject new laws that ignore their territories and attacks by President Jair Bolsonaro's government against indigenous peoples. Bolsonaro cares more about the Soccer Cup than the Brazilian people's health, they complained. We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this. Welcome back. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is having its 31st summit in Brussels. They are expected to declare China as their new main military enemy, along with Russia, after the group of 7 had agreed the previous day on a $40 billion plan to counteract China's Road and Belt Trade Initiative. The initial NATO session had plenty of anti-China and anti-Russia rhetoric. United States President Joe Biden presented himself as a tough guy, renewing his country's commitment to the defense of Europe and demanding support to contain China and Russia, which are considered a threat. Both countries are already surrounded by hundreds of U.S. military bases. The NATO alliance was set up in the Cold War years to put a military barrier to the expansion of socialist countries, led back then by the Soviet Union. This is the first time China will be classified as a security risk for the entire military alliance of capitalist countries. And during the last day of the summit, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has announced that the G7 wealthy nations have pledged over 1 billion coronavirus vaccine doses for poorer nations, half of them coming from the United States. Yet again, nothing came out on the key issue of releasing vaccine patents, which pharmaceuticals transnational corporations oppose.
A week ago, I asked my fellow leaders to help in preparing and providing the doses we need to vaccinate the whole world by the end of 2022. I'm very pleased to announce that this weekend, leaders have pledged over 1 billion doses, either directly or through funding to COVAX. That includes 100 million from the UK to the world's poorest countries, which is another big step towards vaccinating the world. And that's in addition to everything scientists and governments and the pharmaceutical industry have done so far to roll out one of the largest vaccination programs in history.
On the other hand, social activists on Sunday dismissed the pledge from the G7 nations group to donate 1 billion vaccine doses to poorer countries. They said it was nowhere near enough to stop the global pandemic.
You know, it's funny that the communique says they will do everything they can as fast as possible, and then they talk about 1 year, 1 billion in the next 1 year. It's quite interesting to see how they think that 1 billion doses for 1 year would actually end the pandemic. That's really funny because that would not even take care of 5% of the population. And so it's kind of disappointing because the whole world was really looking up to this richest country that come together, hoping that they could mobilize as a group, to really try to end the pandemic on time. Because the longer it stays, of course, the whole world suffers from that. But we just believe that this is inadequate. It doesn't show the urgency that is required.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has called for a waiver of coronavirus vaccine patents. Speaking at the G7 summit in England, the African leader reiterated that the waiver will allow African nations and other countries like India to produce enough vaccines for their people who are in desperate need of them.
And we argued that, as South Africa and India have proposed, we should waive the TRIPS process or measure at the WTO. And what we got here is a commitment that, yes, the negotiations should ensue at the WTO. We're rather pleased with this, having amassed more than 100 countries as South Africa and India in support of our proposals. We think there's been progress in the form of enabling the negotiations to happen on the text that should be looked at by all countries. And we argued that, as South Africa and India have proposed, we should waive the TRIPS process or measure at the WTO. And what we got here is a commitment that, yes, the negotiations should ensue at the WTO. We're rather pleased with this, having amassed more than 100 countries as South Africa and India in support of our proposals. We think there's been progress in the form of enabling the negotiations to happen on the text that should be looked at by all countries.
At least 12 people have been killed and 37 seriously injured after a gas explosion at a residential neighborhood in central China. Images supplied by Chinese media show rescue workers climbing over broken concrete slabs to reach people still trapped inside. Investigations into the cause of the explosion were still going on. The explosion comes a day after 8 people were killed and 3 others injured in an accident at a chemical facility in Guiyang province.
As of 14 hours, the city's party committee and government have deployed 2,000 rescuers to carry out the search and rescue operation. A total of 913 households have been evacuated and 138 injured people have been sent to hospital for treatment, 37 of whom are severely injured. 12 people died.
And we have more news coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back. Israel's parliament has voted in favor of a new coalition government ending Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's 12-year rule. Extreme nationalist Naftali Bennett, a former ally of Netanyahu, so presiding over a diverse coalition conformed by 8 parties with deep ideological differences among them. Netanyahu leader. Sunday's vote in which Israel state held 4 elections. And hundreds of people celebrated Netanyahu's ousting in the streets of occupied Jerusalem. The now former prime minister has been under investigation for corruption over several years. His faith was sealed after failing to stop the Palestinian resistance from reaching most of Israel, an improvement with Naftali Bennett.
We believe that the new government has no future if it does not take into consideration the future of the Palestinian people and their legitimate rights, whose number is now greater than the number of Israelis between the river and the sea. What is required of the new Israeli government is to start working to end the occupation and its colonial tools, such as settlements and others, and to recognize the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people.
Mali's new transition has taken office after being sworn in last week. The new leader brought his government together for the first time. They assigned this government to make a roadmap in preparation also pledged to bring civilians back into power. Maiga is a former minister and member of which helped to oust former President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta last August. Several people have been injured and dozens others arrested during anti-government protests in Nigeria's cities of Lagos and Abuja. Nigerian police fired tear gas to disperse the protesters who were demonstrating against bad governance and insecurity, as well as the recent Twitter ban by the government of President Muhammadu Buhari. Activists called for nationwide protests to be staged the same day when Nigeria was celebrating its Democracy Day, which marks Nigeria's move to civilian rule more than 20 years ago.
Lack of proper care, kidnapping, banditry, we can go on and on and on. So the people are protesting against a failed government. They are saying enough is enough. Who is the head of that government? It is the president. If the president cannot assure us, if we have even moved past the stage of assurances, if the president cannot swing into action and ensure that the lives of citizens are safeguarded, then he should resign.
And thousands have demonstrated in Burkina Faso to demand security from the government following last weekend's deadly terrorist attack. The demonstrators, who came from different parts of the country, marched in the city of Dori, blaming the government for not properly securing the area, resulting in continued attacks by militants. At least 132 people have been killed last week by armed militants in Solhan department. The demonstrations were organized several days ago by civil society organizations and local residents. And the Pope Francis has demanded humanitarian aid be delivered to residents of the war-torn Tigray region in northern Ethiopia. Speaking at his Sunday noon blessing, Francis said he was thinking of the people of Tigray, who have been struck by a grave humanitarian crisis that has exposed the poorest to famine. Francis also called for an immediate end to fighting in Tigray, the return of social harmony, and for all food aid and health care to be warranted. The United Nations and social activist groups said more than 350,000 people in Tigray are suffering famine, with millions more at risk of it.
Exploitation of children who are deprived of the right to play, to study, and to dream. According to the estimate of the International Labour Organization, today the children exploited for labor are over 150 million. It's a tragedy. This is happening today. Many children are suffering because of this. To be exploited for child labor. Let's renew all together the effort to eliminate this slavery of our times.
And we have come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find this and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, if you feel so inclined, please join us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.